Without further ado, the author of Bagels and Locks, my father, comedian, Norm Winkler.
Wow, what an introduction. You know, I just wanted to say that I've had... Louder. Thank you. Is this better? Not better? How could you answer no if you couldn't hear me?
Let's try that.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. I was going to say that I've been doing this for close to 20 years now, and I've had some wonderful introductions. But this introduction today, I must say, without a doubt, is the most recent one I've ever had. Okay, with your permission, take my jacket off.
Sure.
Thanks. Here, Norm. Thank you. I would just like to say that I'd like you now to just sit back, relax, lower your expectations, and enjoy. Okay? The reason I always wanted to be a stand-up comedian is because I figured in case I wasn't any good, at least nobody would laugh at me. When I say nobody laughing, it's not good. Okay, let me tell you this. Picture this if you can. Mr. and Mrs. Cohen are standing in line at the El Al counter waiting to board the plane for Israel. She is so excited. It's their very first trip. They've been saving for 25 years. She turns to her husband. She says, "I can't believe we're going." He says, "I should have brought the piano." He said, "What?" He says, "I should have brought the piano." She says, "What are you talking about? Why should you have brought the piano?" She says, "Because our airplane tickets are at home on the piano." During the Olympics, the athletes were out on the field warming up and practicing, and an American reporter went over to one and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you a pole vaulter?" The guy says, "Yeah, that's right. I am a pole. But how did you know my name was Vaulter?" Okay. This man, anybody here ever won the lottery? Okay.
I tried.
I tried. Very good. Moshe won the lottery. Okay? He was so excited. He won $5 million. He went to shul the next morning, and all his buddies were saying, "Oy, mazel tov, Moshe, mazel tov. We just want to know one thing. How did you happen to pick the right number?" He says, "I'll tell you. My mother always told me," but first of all, let me say, it was a combination of seichel and muzzle, okay? My mother always told me that 7 was a lucky number.
Yeah.
The 7th day of the week is Shabbos, the 7 branches to the candelabra. He says, so this is where the seichel comes in. I figured if 7 is a lucky number, then 7 times 7 would be even more lucky, so I picked 48. So I says, "But Moshe, 7 times 7 isn't 48, it's 49. He says, "Ah, that's where the muzzle comes in. I was never good in arithmetic." Okay. Speaking of the lottery, there's this lovely Jewish couple who lived in London, England, and they won a $50 million lottery. They bought a huge mansion. She had all types of servants, even a butler. One afternoon, before they were going out, the woman said to the butler, "Our friends, the Cohens, are coming for dinner tonight. So instead of setting the table for just 2, says, would you please set the table for 4? He says, "Yes, madam, no problem." They went out. A couple of hours later, they came home. He looked into the dining room. She looked in the dining room, and she saw the table was set for 6. So she called the butler, and she says, "Didn't I tell you to set the table for 4? He says, "Yes, ma'am, you did. But while you were out, Your friends, the Cohens, phoned, and they said they're bringing the Blintzes. You know, here's a quickie one. These two fellas are met on the street. One has a brown paper bag, and the other one says to him, "What do you got in the bag?" So the guy says, "Fish." He says, "If I can guess how many fish you have in the bag, will you give me one?" He says, "If you can guess how many fish I have in this bag, I'll give you both of them." Everybody know what the Channel is? The Channel is a tunnel that runs from England to France under the English Channel. Okay, years ago, today it's a reality, but before they were building it, they sent tenders out all over the world. And the tenders came back with hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, and as they're going through them all, they came across one from a Mr. Goldberg in New York City for $35,000. They figured, $35,000, we better bring this man over, talk to him, and make sure I don't understand $35,000. So they flew him over to England. They sat him down. They said, "Mr. Cohen, Mr. Goldberg, before we do anything else, we just want to ask you one question. You quoted $35,000. Is that right?" He says, "That's right." He says, "Well, can we see the blueprints? Do you have the blueprints with you?" He says, "Blueprints, schmooprints, who needs blueprints?" He says, "I'll tell you. Me and my brother, we are in business together. I take a shovel, he takes a shovel. I start digging in England, he starts digging in France. We meet in the middle, and you got your tunnel." So the guy says, but what, suppose you don't meet in the middle? So he says, "No, so you'll have two tunnels." The man's sitting in a restaurant. The waiter brings him some soup, a bowl of soup. A few minutes later, he calls it, "Waiter, come over here." He says, "Yes, sir, what's the problem?" He says, "Taste the soup." So the waiter says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Taste the soup." He says, if you're not happy with the soup, I'll bring you another bowl." He says, "Taste the soup." And he picks up the waiter, sits him down on the chair, and he says, "Now, taste the soup." So the waiter looks around and he says, "Well, where's the spoon?" He says, "Aha!" Does everybody know? We got somebody who understands their. This gentleman was asked to speak to a Jewish group, and the speech had to be all in Jewish. So all day long he was figuring out what to say, writing it down in Jewish. There was one word he didn't know how to say in Jewish, and that word was disappointed. So he called his partner and he says, "Marvin, how do you say disappointed in Jewish?" Marvin says, "Gee, I don't know. But you know, my mother would know. I'm going to give her a call." So he phones up to his mother and he says, "Hello, Ma. If I phoned you on Monday morning and I told you that we're all coming for Shabbos dinner Friday night, and then I phoned you Friday morning and I told you we couldn't come, what would you say?" She says, "Oy, ich bin so disappointed." This is the story of a woman who's going to visit her son in his new apartment. It's just a couple of towns away from where she lives. She came, she knocked at the door, he opened the door, they hugged, they kissed, and she looked inside and she saw there was a beautiful girl in there. And her son says, "Mother, I'd like you to meet Mary. She's my roommate." Now, we split everything. Mary has her own room. I have my own room. We split all the hydro bill, the electric bill, everything we split, we go half and half. So that was fine. She had a wonderful weekend there with them. On Sunday night, she went home. Monday morning, Mary says to him, "You know what? since your mother left, I haven't been able to find the silver soup ladle. So he says, you know what? I'll drop her a line. He writes, Dear Mother, I'm not saying you took the silver soup ladle, and I'm not saying you didn't take the silver soup ladle. But since you left, we haven't been able to find it. 2 days later, gets a letter back. My dear son, I'm not saying that Mary sleeps in her own bed, and I'm not saying that Mary doesn't sleep in her own bed. But if she did sleep in her own bed, you would have found the silver soup ladle by now. Explain. This man calls his mother. He says, Hello, Ma, how are you? She says, not so good. He says, why? What's the matter? He says, I'm so tired. I can't move. He says, why are you so tired? She says, I haven't eaten in 18 days. He says, you haven't eaten in 18 days? How come? She says, I didn't want my mouth to be full in case you fold. Thanksgiving holiday in the United States is a very big holiday. Everybody celebrates it. This woman had a plantation, a big plantation down south, and it was just about a mile away from an Army base. And a week before Thanksgiving, she called to the base and said, we are going to have a big Thanksgiving dinner here today, and if you would, or rather on Thanksgiving, and if you would like to send 3 soldiers, we would be glad to have them join us for dinner. The man says, absolutely, thank you so much. He says, but just wait, one moment. He says, don't send any Jews. He says, okay, ma'am, and hangs up the phone. Thanksgiving arrives in the afternoon. There's a knock at the door. The woman goes to the door. There's 3 good-looking, handsome black men standing there in uniform. She says, yes. They say, we're here for the Thanksgiving dinner. He says, there must be some mistake. He says, no, ma'am. Captain Shapiro never makes mistakes. Oh, man. You know, this woman walks into a butcher shop, and she says, how much are your lamb chops? So he says, $8 a pound. He says, $8 a pound? The butcher across the road sells them for $4 a pound. He says, so go over there and buy them from him. He says, well, he doesn't have any. So the guy says, when I don't have any, I sell them for $2 a pound. A Martian, a little spaceship from Mars, lands in Toronto. A Martian gets out, and a man comes over to him and he says, tell me, have all you Martians got one great googly boogly eye right in the middle of your face? The guy says, yes. He says, do all you Martians have 2 antennae growing out of the top of your head? He says, yes. He says, do all you Martians wear those little black beanies on your head? He says, no, only the Orthodox. This is the story of a man who used to preface all his words with oy vey. He'd say, oy vey, it's time to get up. Oy vey, have I got time to eat breakfast? Oy vey, I have to go to work. Everything was oy vey. The man had a grandson who loved airplanes. He always wanted to go for a ride in an airplane. And it happened that the grandfather had a friend who owned his own plane. So he went over to him and he says, oy vey, if you could take my grandson for a ride in the airplane, he says, oy vey, it would be such a mitzvah. The guy says, look, I've never mentioned this to you before. He says, for 25 years I've known you. Every time it drives me crazy when you say, oy vey this, oy vey that. If you promise not to say oy vey even once when you're up in the plane. He says, I'll give you and your grandson a ride, come back tomorrow. Next day, they came back, they got into the plane, the pilot takes off, he's doing spins and he's flying upside down and inside out, and he's doing everything. Finally, 20 minutes later, he lands the plane, he gets out, he walks over to the old man and he says, congratulations. He says, I can't believe it. You didn't say oy vey even once. Guy says, I'll tell you, it wasn't easy, especially when my grandson fell out of the airplane. This is the story of a man who used to phone his mother every single day. He had to go overseas to Asia, as a matter of fact, for a 3-week business trip. And when he was away for a couple of days, he went into a pet shop and he said, you know, my mother misses my calls so much. Do you have anything I could send to my mother to keep her company until I get home? So the pet keeper says, I have just what you need. She says, I have a parrot that speaks 12 languages. If you could give me the address, I'll send it to your mother, and she'll have somebody to talk to and keep her company. That's what he did. 3 weeks later, he got home. The first thing he did was go over to the telephone. He says, hello, Ma. He says, how did you like the bird I sent you? She says, it was delicious. He says, what do you mean delicious? He says, I made from that bird a fricassee like I'd never tasted in my whole life. He says, but Ma, he says, that bird spoke 12 languages. She says, no, so why didn't he say something? You know, there's just one thing I don't understand, and that is, I thought that this is supposed to be a group for people between 55 and 120, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm looking around the room here, and I think some of you ladies must have sneaked past the guard, because you surely don't look like you're 55 years of age. Okay, that's your problem. There's 120? Right. There's an ancient rabbi who found the secret of living to 120. And since you came here today, I'm going to let you in on that secret. This is what he said. To live to 120, he says, make it to 119 and then be very, very careful. This man did something wrong, unfortunately, and he was sent to prison. The first day, they were sitting at lunch. Everything was quiet. A man stood, one of the prisoners stood up and said, 73, and everybody burst out laughing. Just looking. Another man got up. He said, 28. Everybody burst out laughing again. So he turned to the prisoner beside him and he says, I don't understand. He says, this is my first day here. I don't know what this, why are they laughing at just a number? He says, I'll tell you. When we have lunch here, we can't talk very much. We don't have too much time. We have a book of jokes. Every joke has a number. He says, if somebody gets up and tells the joke, he says, if it's funny, they laugh. So he says, you know what, I'll lend you my book, okay? He gave him the book. All night long he stayed up looking all over the jokes. The best joke in the book, the funniest, was number 33. They could hardly wait for lunch the next day. He was sitting down. Everything was quiet. He got up and he said, 33. Just like this. There wasn't a sound. Nobody laughed. So he turned to the guy beside him. He says, 33 was the funniest joke in the book. How come nobody laughed? The guy says, it's not the joke. He says, it's the way you tell it. This is the story of a woman. Has everybody finished laughing? Okay. I guess not. Okay. This woman walked into an artist portrait studio and she said to the artist, "Excuse me," she says, "do you paint pictures?" The guy says, "Yes, I do." She says, "Could you paint from me a picture?" He says, "Absolutely." She says, "I don't want it to look better than me. I don't want it to look worse than me. I want it should be me." He says, "Absolutely, no problem." She says, "When you finish, if you have just a little bit of paint left, could you paint on my finger a big diamond ring?" He says, "Yes, I could do that, no problem." She says, "And if you still have a little bit of paint left, could you paint a necklace around my neck with rubies and diamonds and jewels and pearls?" He says, "Yes, I can do that, certainly." And she says, "If you have just a teeny weeny little bit of paint left, paint on my head a tiara full of jewels." He says, "Why? I don't understand. Why do you want this?" The woman says, "I'll tell you. You don't know my husband. When I die, he's going to right away get married again. And I want that new wife should go crazy looking for the jewelry." Okay, this is what you hear. "Hello, this is Lufthansa flight 669. We are having a little bit of trouble. One of our engines has conked it out, and we will land anywhere except in Israel." Perfectly quiet. 5 minutes later, "Hello, this is Lufthansa flight 669. One more of our engines has just conked it out, and we will land anywhere except Israel." Quiet. Guess what? A few minutes later, he says, "This is Lufthansa flight 669. The other two engines have now conked it out, and we are up here with no power, and we will land anywhere, even in Israel." This is what you hear. "Hello, flight 667. This is Ben Gurion Airport calling. I understand you're having a little bit trouble. I'll tell you what, don't worry, we have it all under control. Just repeat after me. Yiskadal, Yiskadal." This man had a terrible accident at work in a machine he was using. It cut off all his fingers. His 10 fingers were cut off. He bent down to the ground, picked them up, ran to the hospital with them, and he said to the doctor, can you sew my fingers back on again?" He says, "Certainly, no problem." He says, "But I just need to know one thing. After you sew them back on, and after they heal, will I be able to play the piano?" So the doctor says, "I don't see why not." The guy says, "That's fantastic." He says, "I could never play the piano before." Okay. This takes place in a divorce court. The judge says to the little boy, "Would you like to live with your mother?" He says, "No." He says, "Why not?" He says, "My mother beats me." He says, "Oh." He says, "Would you like to live with your father?" He says, "No." He says, "Why not?" He says, "He beats me too." So the judge says, "Well, who would you like to live with?" It says, "The Toronto Maple Leafs. They never beat anybody." I don't know whether this one, I guess it's okay. What's coming up here now? Okay. This takes place in the Garden of Eden. The Lord said to Adam, go and give Eve a hug. So he says, well, what's a hug? He says, go over to Eve, put your arms around her, pull her towards you, and that's a hug. Half an hour later, he came back. He says, wow, he said, that hug was really, really good. I enjoyed it. He says, fine. Now go back to Eve and give her a kiss. He says, well, what's a kiss? He says, you take her, you hold her around like you did before, and press your lips against hers. So he says, okay, goes away. Half an hour later, he comes back again. He says, wow. He says, that kiss was even better than the hug. He says, it's fantastic. So the Lord says, now go forth and multiply. Half hour later, he comes back and he says, Lord, what's a headache? This man met a lady on the street that he hadn't seen for 20 years. They went to school together, and they started to reminisce about their times at high school. And she said, you know what? I live just a few blocks from here. Why don't you come in? I'll make you a cup of tea, and let's talk about the days we had, the fun we had in high school. He says, okay, very good. And that's what they did. They went to the house, they're sitting and talking. Suddenly the woman says, look, my husband is coming. He's so very jealous. He says, you have to go, jump out the window. He says, but we're not doing anything wrong. He says, jump out the window if he finds you here. Anyway, that was it. Next morning, he was telling his friends what happened. He said, you know, there I was, holding on to the windowsill with my hands, with my fingers. Her husband came into the room, and he saw my fingers there. He went into the kitchen, and he got a fork, and he shoved the fork under my fingernails. I guess that made you mad. He says, no, that didn't make me mad. He says, but then he went into the kitchen, and he got a jar of molasses, and he took the molasses and he poured it all over my head. It was running down my face. He says, I guess that made you mad. He says, no, that didn't make me mad. He says, but then he went into the bedroom. He took a pillow. He cut open the pillow, and he took the feathers and he sprinkled it all down on the molasses. I was covered with it. Guy says, I guess that made you mad. He says, no, that didn't make me mad either. He says, but when I looked down and I saw I was only 2 feet from the ground, that made me mad. Here's a story of a doctor who was a reporter who was interviewing a 100-year-old man. And he said to him, in the 100 years, what in your mind, he says, is the greatest invention that you have seen in the last 100 years? The man says, without a doubt. He says, without a doubt, the greatest invention is the thermos bottle. The guy says, what? He says, the thermos bottle. He says, how come? He says, look, if you put something hot in it, it stays hot. If you put something cold in it, it stays cold. How does it know? No? Anybody know how? Tony. Okay, here's one for all the lovely ladies here. There was an elderly Jewish man was walking along the beach in Los Angeles. He had his shoes off, and suddenly he kicked something in the sand. So he bent down, and it was a magic lamp. He took it up, picked it up, and he was wiping the sand off it, and suddenly a genie came out and said, you saved me. I've been inside this lamp for 1,000 years. anything that you would like, I'll give you. And you just name it, and it's yours. So the man thinks for a minute. He says, you know, my friends and I, he says, we don't like to fly anymore in airplanes. So if you could build a road from Los Angeles, a highway from Los Angeles to Hawaii, he says, then we could all drive there at our own speed, and that would be terrific. The guy says, a highway from Los Angeles to Hawaii? He says, that's impossible. He says, just pick anything else you want. So he says, okay. He says, you know what? It's a couple of weeks before Pesach here now. If you could make it that my wife would just be relaxed, she wouldn't be upset, she didn't have to worry about the shopping and the dishes and the cooking, you know. He said, just a minute. He says, was that a 2-lane highway or a 4-lane highway you wanted? This is a story of Tony and Marvin. They were great pals. They went to university together. They were roommates. Graduation came, and Marvin's father gave him a Rolex watch. And Tony's father gave him a gun. After the ceremony was over, they went back to their room, and Tony says, wow, he says, a Rolex watch. He says, I always wanted a Rolex watch. Oh. And Marvin says, you know what? A gun. I've never even touched a real gun before in my whole life. So Tony says, you know, you want the gun. I want the watch. Why don't we trade? That's what they did. They changed presents, okay? The next evening, Tony was at home having dinner with his parents. His father looks down and he says, hey, where did you get that Rolex watch? So Tony told him the story of what he did. He says, what's the matter? He says, you crazy or something? Someday you're going to get married. One day you're going to come home and you're going to find your wife with another man. What are you going to do? You're going to walk over there and say, hey, you know what time it is? But I wonder if any of you have ever heard about the duck who walked into a bar. And he walked over to the bartender and he says, got any bagels? So the bartender says, what? The duck says, have you got any bagels? The guy says, this is a bar. What are you talking about? Get out. So the duck waddled away. 10 minutes later, he's back again, walks over to the bar and says, got any bagels? He says, I told you we don't sell bagels here. Go. What happened 5 minutes later? He's back again, and he says, got any bagels? The bartender says, look, I told you we don't sell bagels here. If you come back in here once more, I'm going to take those webbed feet of yours and nail them right to the floor. So he turns around and walks out. Believe it or not, a few minutes later, the duck comes back in, he looks up at the bartender, he says, got any nails? The bartender says, no. He says, got any bagels? Remember our friend Mr. Clinton, President of the United States? He was on a trip, a European trip, and he was in England, and in England they gave him a beautiful piece of worsted material, the finest worsted, to have him a suit made. Anyway, a couple of days later, he was in France. So he went into a French tailor, and he said, showed him the material. He says, oh, that's a beautiful piece of material, Mr. Clinton, but he measured him up. He says, there's not enough material here to make you a suit. He says, I can make you a beautiful jacket, but that's all. So Clayton says, no, it's okay. Next day, he was in Italy. Same thing, he went into Italian tailor. And he says, can you make me a suit from this material? He looks at it, he says, oh, such a beautiful piece of material, but you know what? There's not enough here. I can make you a pair of pants, and that's all. So Clayton said, no, it's okay. A couple of days later, he was in Israel. So he figured, you know what? Just try a Jewish tailor. So he went into, he showed him the material. The man measured him, and he says, Mr. Clinton, from this piece of material, I can make you a suit like you never had. A jacket, 2 pairs of pants, a vest, and there'll be enough left for a self-belt. This guy says, I don't understand. In France, they said it was not enough. In Italy, they said it was not enough. How come here in Israel you can make me such a suit? The guy says, to tell you the truth, he says, here in Israel, you're not such a big man. Remember Mr. Mulrooney, our famous guy? Mulrooney was out fishing in a boat. Suddenly the boat hit a rock and started to sink. There were 3 boys in a rowboat. They rowed over, and he's yelling, help, help. They schlepped him, they pulled him into their boat. And he said to the boys, you 3 saved my life. You just make any request you like, and I'll give it to you. He turns to the first one, he says, what would you like, son? Boy said, you know, I would really like a Cadillac convertible. He said, you've got it. Absolutely, don't worry. Turn to the second boy, and he says, and what would you like? He says, I would like to travel all over the world, see all the different countries and the people. He says, it's yours. Definitely. Turns to the third boy, and he says, how about you, son? What would you like? He says, I would like you to pay for my funeral. So Rooney says, what? How come? He says, when my father finds out who I saved, he's going to kill me. Okay, here's what. I don't know whether you heard about the accident on 401. It was a very, very serious accident. When the police got there, they found a man and a woman unconscious, and there was a monkey jumping around in the car. So they looked in, and they said to the monkey, what happened? What was doing here? So the monkey goes like this. He says, what, they were smoking pot? Monkey says, yeah, yeah, yeah. He says, what else were they doing? He says, so they were drinking? Monkey says, yeah, yeah, yeah. Were they doing anything else? He said, they were kissing? He says, yeah. So the cop says to the monkey, what were you doing while all this was going on? So the monkey goes, you know, during the SixDay War, the Israeli soldiers were told that they would get $100 in American money for every Arab soldier that they captured. Well, these 2 guys volunteered right away because they figured, wow, they could make a fortune. They were out there one day, all night, the second day, the second night. Not one Arab could they find. And one said to the other, you know what, we're going to get so tired, we're both going to fall asleep, and that's no good. He says, I'll stay up for a couple hours, then I'll wake you up. Anyway, guess what happened? They both fell asleep. Okay? At that time, 500 Arabs came and circled around them. They pointed their guns down to the top of them. And one of the guys opened his eyes, and he looked up, and he saw 500 Arabs, guns pointing right down at them. And he says to his friend, Moshe, wake up quick, we're rich, we're rich. You know, this is a story of a Texan gentleman who went to Israel, and they took him on a tour. And they stopped at a kibbutz, and there was, the Texan was talking to an Israeli farmer. And the farmer said, I just want you to see. He says, you see that tree over there? That my land goes all the way from that tree right to that fence. It's all mine. So the Texan says, hey, you know what, son? He says, back in Texas, he says, I've got a ranch. I get in my car at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it takes me till 6 o'clock at night till I get over to the other side. The Israeli farmer says, you know, I used to have a car like that. This man walked into his father's apartment. He says, Father is watching television. He says, hey, Pa. He says, I didn't know you like sports. He says, are you kidding? Basketball, he says, my favorite sport. So the guy says, well, what's the score? The old man says, 88 to 66. He says, who's winning? He says, 88? These two drunken gentlemen, can't call them gentlemen, two drunks are walking on the street. One says to the other, hey, is that the sun or the moon up there? Guy says, don't ask me. I don't live around here. A man came to the door. The woman answered the door. He says, lady, do you have some work for me? I can do all kinds of jobs. He says, whatever you have to do. I says, I need money. She says, okay, you know what? If you want to go around to the back, you'll see a can of paint. And if you want to paint the porch, I'll give you $50. He says, great. And away he goes. An hour later, knocks at the door. He says, okay, lady. He says, I did the job. I painted the porch. She opened her purse, took out $50, and gave it to him. He said, thank you very much. Started to walk away. And suddenly he turned around and he said, oh, by the way, that's not a porch. That's a Mercedes. This gentleman was up at a summer resort in the Catskills. He arrived in the afternoon. He could hardly wait to go out for a walk. He was walking along. About 20 minutes later, he came back again. And it was terrible. He came back and he was so nervous. He was banging on the door. They opened the door to the hotel. He collapsed right on the floor. And they said to him, they brought him to, and they said, what's the problem? What happened? He says, I'll tell you. I went for a walk, and suddenly I saw a snake. He says, but the snake turned out to be a stick. So I said, what are you so upset for? Guy, I'll tell you, he says, the snake, the stick that I picked up to kill the snake turned out to be a snake. I don't understand that one either. These two gentlemen, nice Jewish elderly gentlemen, they had a company. One was Mr. Schwartz and one was Mr. Goldman. And they had a company called Schwartz and Goldman. But they weren't doing well at all. They asked their friend, what do you think we could do in order to make more business? So he says, I'll tell you. He says, maybe your names are a little bit too Jewish, maybe, for this area that you're in. He says, why don't you change your names and try that? He said, that's a pretty good idea. So Mr. Schwartz says, you know, I like the name Smith. So I'm going to change my name to Smith. And Mr. Goldberg says, you know, I like Smith too. I'll change my name to Smith also. So the company will be Smith and Smith. They made a new sign. The next morning, the phone rang. The secretary answers the phone. Good morning, Smith and Smith. So the guy says, let me speak to Mr. Smith, please. He says, which Mr. Smith do you want? Schwartz or Goldberg? This is the story of a traveling salesman who had been on the road for about a month and a half, all through Europe, and now he landed in England, and he had to do some work there. But there was a big convention going on in England, and he couldn't find a hotel room. He went over to one hotel and he said, please, you've got to give me a room. I'm so tired. We've been going for a month and a half, even if it's for a few hours. So the owner of the hotel manager says, I'll tell you what. He says, we have one room left, and that's the bridal suite. He says, if you want to go in there for just an hour, 2-3 hours, he says, that'll be okay, because by then, the bride and groom are going to be coming. He says, oh, that'll really help, no problem. And that's what he did. Everything was fine. Got up. A couple of hours later, went down, and he said to the manager, thank you so much. He says, I really, really enjoyed what you did for me. The couple of hours of sleep really helped me. And then he looks around, and he says, oh, I forgot my umbrella. He says, my umbrella's up in the room. He says, my wife gave me that umbrella 25 years ago. Everywhere I go, I take the umbrella with me. I got to go back up and get the umbrella. So he says, I'm sorry, you can't do that. He says, the bride and groom are in there now. He said, I can't leave without it. Okay, they went up to the room. They put their ear to the door, and this is what they heard.
Yeah.
Whose gorgeous blonde hair is this? And he hears, it's mine, it's mine. He says, whose beautiful blue eyes are these? They're mine, they're mine. And whose gorgeous sparkling white teeth are those? He says, they're mine, they're mine. The salesman couldn't stand it any longer. Puts his mouth up to the door. He says, when you get to the umbrella, it's mine, it's mine. These are 3 little quick restaurants jokes. Oh, but first of all, before I say that, this couple had been married for 75 years. And somebody asked them, what is your secret of marriage for 75 years? He says, I'll tell you. Twice a week, my wife and I go to a nice restaurant. My wife and I go out to a restaurant. We have some good food. We have some wine. And that's the secret. She goes Tuesday night. I go Thursday. In the restaurant, the waiter came over to the man as he was finishing his dinner. He says, how did you find your steak, sir? He says, it was easy. I just moved a tiny little French fry, and there it was. Waiter comes back in another restaurant. He says, what would you have, sir? He says, I see you have gravy on the menu. I says, yes, that's right. He says, what would you like? He says, I would like a clean menu. Guy's at a restaurant. The waitress says to him, what would you like? He says, I'd like a bowl of meatloaf and some kind words. He says, okay. 20 minutes later, she brings him back a plate of meatloaf and turns to leave. He says, just a minute, just a minute. He says, you gave me the meatloaf, but you didn't give me any kind words. The waitress leans over and says, don't eat the meatloaf.